All right, hi you guys. We are back with our next chapter reading for History Alive and our Ancient Greece unit. So again, we're reading out of our History Alive, the Ancient World textbook, and today we're going to read chapter 27, which is Athens and Sparta, two of kind of the most famous, notorious city-states of the ancient Greeks, and we're going to compare and contrast what life was like in those two different city-states. So, starting with chapter 27, Life in Two City-States, Athens and Sparta, Introduction, Section 1. In chapter 26, you learn that ancient Greece was a collection of city-states, each with its own government. In this chapter, you will learn about two of the most important Greek city-states, Athens and Sparta. They not only had different forms of government, but very different ways of life. Athens was a walled city near the sea. Nearby ships came and went from a busy port. Inside the city walls, master potters and sculptors labored in workshops. Wealthy people and their slaves strolled through the marketplace. Often the city citizens, freemen, gathered to loudly debate the issues of the day. Sparta was located in a farming area on a plain. No walls surrounded the city. Its buildings were simple and plain compared to those of Athens. Even the clothing of the people in the streets was drab, boring, nothing fancy. Columns of soldiers tramped through the streets with fierce expressions behind their bronze helmets. Even a casual visitor could see that Athens and Sparta were very different. Let's take a closer look at the way the people lived in the two city-states. We'll examine each city's government, economy, education, and the treatment of women and slaves. Chapter 27, Section 2, Comparing Two City-States. Athens and Sparta were both Greek cities, and they were only about 150 miles apart, yet they were as different as they could be. Why? Part of the answer is geography. Athens is in central Greece, only 4 miles from the Aegean Sea. Its location encouraged Athenians to look outward toward the world beyond their city. Athenians liked to travel. They were eager to spend their own ideas and to learn from others. They were eager to spread their own ideas and learn from others. They encouraged artists from other parts of Greece to come and share their knowledge of art and architecture. Athens developed strong relationships with other city-states, and it grew large and powerful through trade. A great fleet made its leading naval power in Greece. In contrast, Sparta was more isolated, so out in the middle of nowhere. It was located on a plain between the mountains and the sea in a part of Greece known as the Peloponnesus. Spartans were suspicious of outsiders and their ideas. They grew much of what they needed in the fertile soil around Sparta. What they couldn't grow, they often took from their neighbors through power and their armies. While Athenians boasted of their art and culture, Spartans valued strength and simplicity. They taught their sons and daughters to fight, and they produced soldiers rather than artists and thinkers. For most of their histories, the two city-states were bitter rivals. As you can see, their differences were reflected in every part of life. Next, we're going to look at chapter 27, section 3, Athenian government. As you learned in the last chapter, Athens became a democracy around 500 BCE, or about 2,500 years ago. But unlike modern democracies, Athens only allowed freemen to be citizens. All men over the age of 18 who were born in Athens were Athenian citizens. Women and slaves were not citizens. Every citizen could take part in the city's government. A group called the Council of 500 met every single day. Each year, the names of all citizens 30 years of age or older were collected, and 500 of those names were chosen. The council ran the day-to-day business of government and suggested new laws. Proposed laws had to be approved by a much larger group, the assembly. The assembly met on a hill every 10 days. At least 6,000 citizens had to be present for a meeting to take place. If not enough people showed up, slaves would round up more citizens with ropes dipped in red paint. Men were embarrassed to appear at the meeting with their clothes stained with red marks. The assembly debated and voted on laws proposed by the council. Every citizen had the right to speak at assembly meetings. Some speakers were more skilled than others. Some spoke longer than others. Sometimes a water clock was used to time the speaker. One cup of water was set above another. The first cup had a small hole drilled in the bottom. The speaker could talk only until all the water ran out of the top cup into the bottom cup. Most Athenian men enjoyed taking part in the city's democracy. They liked to gather and debate the issues. They were proud of their freedom and Athenian citizens. Now next I'm going to actually read the Spartan government section. So I'm going to read the chapter a little out of order so we can see the difference between Athenian government and the Spartan government. Okay, so this is chapter 26, but technically section 7, Spartan government. Sparta was different from Athens in almost every way, beginning with its government. While Athens was a democracy, Sparta was an oligarchy. As you learn in chapter 26, in an oligarchy, the ruling power is in the hands of a few people, many times 3, but not always. Like Athens, Sparta had an assembly, but the important decisions were really made by a much smaller group called the Council of Elders. The Council of Elders consisted of 2 kings and 28 other men. The 2 kings inherited their position and shared equal powers. The other 28 members of the council were elected by the assembly. To be elected to the Council of Elders, men had to be at least 60 years old and from a noble family. Some scholars believe that the assembly members shouted for the man they wanted most. The candidates who received the loudest support were elected. Once they were elected, they served for life. The Council of Elders held the real power in Sparta. It prepared laws for the assembly to vote on, and it had the power to stop any laws passed by the assembly that the council members didn't like. The assembly in Sparta was made up of male citizens. Because the assembly was large, it met in a large outdoor area away from the center of the city. The assembly had very little power. Unlike the assembly in Athens, it did not debate issues. Members of the assembly could only vote yes or no on laws suggested by the Council of Elders. All right, next we're going to go back to Athens and look at Athenian economy, which as we know would be jobs, buying and selling of things. Chapter 27, Section 4, Athenian economy. An important part of life in any community is its economy. An economy is the way a community or region organizes the manufacture and exchange of money, food, products, and services. The Athenian economy was based on trade. The land around Athens did not provide enough food for all of its city's people. But Athens was near the sea and it had a good harbor. So Athenians traded with other city-states and some foreign lands to get the goods and natural resources they needed. The Athenians acquired wood from Italy and grain from Egypt. In exchange, Athenians traded honey, olive oil, silver, and beautifully painted pottery. Athenians brought and sold goods at a huge marketplace called the Agora. There, merchants sold their goods from small stands. People bought lettuce, onions, olive oil, wine, and other foods. They could also buy household items like pottery, furniture, and clay oil lamps. Most Athenians made their clothes at home, but leather sandals and jewelry were popular items at the market. In addition, Athenians bought and sold slaves at the Agora. Like most city-states, Athens developed its own coins to make trade easier. Coins were made of such metals as gold, silver, and bronze. Athenians decorated the flat sides of their coins. One of their coins had an image of the goddess Athena on one side. The other side pictured Athena's favorite bird, the owl. Okay, next we're going to jump to section 8 in chapter 27, which is actually Spartan economy, so we can compare it to the Athenian economy. While the Athenian economy depended on trade, Sparta's economy relied on farming and conquering other people. Sparta didn't have enough land to feed all of its people, so Spartans took the land they needed from their neighbors. Because Spartan men spent their lives as warriors, Sparta used slaves and non-citizens to produce their needed goods. The Spartans turned to their neighbors. The Spartans turned the neighbors they conquered into slaves, called helots. The helots continued to live in their own villages, but they had to give much of the food they grew to the Spartan citizens. The Spartans also made use of non-citizens called parakoi. Parakoi were free men, not slaves. They might serve in the army when needed, but they could not take part in Sparta's government. The Parakoiai made such necessary items as shoes, red cloaks for the soldiers, iron tools like knives and spears, and pottery. They also conducted some trade with other city-states for goods that Sparta could not provide for itself. In general, though, Sparta discouraged trade. The Spartans feared that contact with other city-states would lead to new ideas and weaken their government. Trading with Sparta was also difficult because of its system of money. Legend says that an ancient Spartan leader decided to use iron as money to make it hard to steal. A thief would need a wagon to carry enough iron bars to be valuable. As you can imagine, other city-states were not anxious to receive iron as payment for goods. All right, going back to Athens, we're now going to look at education in Athens, chapter 27, section 5. Athenian democracy depended on having good citizens. Athenians believed that producing good citizens was the main purpose of education. Since only boys grew up to be citizens, boys and girls were educated quite differently. Athenians believed that a good citizen had a sharp mind and a healthy body, so education meant physical training as well as book learning. Until age 6 or 7, boys were taught at home by their mothers or male slaves. From age 6 to 14, boys went to school. Teachers taught reading, writing, arithmetic, fancy word for math, and literature. Books were rare and very expensive, so subjects were read out loud and the boys had to memorize everything. To help them learn, they used writing tablets. Coaches taught sports such as wrestling and gymnastics to strengthen students' muscles. Boys also studied music. They learned to sing and to play the lyre. At 18, Athenian men began their military training. After their service, wealthy young men might study with private teachers. These teachers charged high fees for lessons in debate and public speaking that would help young men become political leaders. Unlike boys, most girls did not learn to read or write. Girls grew up helping their mothers around the house. They were taught to cook, clean, spin thread, and weave cloth. Some also learned ancient secret songs and dances for religious festivals. Girls usually married around the age of 15. We've seen this before, right? Those from wealthy families married men chosen by their fathers. Girls from poor families often had more of a choice. Right, next we're going to look at chapter 27, section 9, education in Sparta. In Sparta, the purpose of education was to produce men and women who could protect the city-state. If a baby did not appear healthy and strong, it might be left to die on a hillside. Spartans valued discipline and strength. From age 7, all Spartan children were trained to fight. Even girls received some military training. They learned wrestling, boxing, foot racing, and gymnastics. Spartan boys lived and trained in buildings called barracks. They were taught to read and write, but Spartans did not consider those skills as important. What was important was to be a brave soldier. Spartan boys were taught to suffer any amount of physical pain without complaining. They marched without shoes, they were not fed well, and they were encouraged to steal food as long as they did not get caught. One Spartan legend tells of a boy who stole a fox because he was starving. When he saw his teacher coming, the boy quickly hid the fox under his cloak. Rather than confess, he let the fox bite his stomach. At age 20 or so, Spartan men were given a difficult test of fitness, military ability, and leadership skills. If they passed, they became Spartan soldiers and full citizens. Even then, they continued to live in soldiers' barracks where they ate, slept, and trained with their classmates. A man could not live at home with his wife and family until he was 30 years old, and his military service continued long after that. All right, lastly, we're going to look at women and slaves in the two city-states. So we're going to start off with Athens, chapter 27, section 6, women and slaves in Athens. As you have already learned, only men were considered citizens in Athens. Women and slaves were not. As a result, they had far fewer rights than free men. Athenian women could not inherit or own much property. They could not vote or attend the assembly. Most could not even choose their own husbands. A few women had jobs. Some women sold goods in the market. A few very important women were priestesses. But most Athenian women had their greatest influence in the home. They spent their days managing the household and bringing up the children. An Athenian wife had separate room at home and never went out alone. She would spin, weave, and supervise the slaves. She educated her sons until they were 6 or 7 and ready for school. She taught her daughters until they were 15 and ready to be married. There were many slaves in ancient Athens. Most people who weren't poor owned at least one slave. Some slaves were born into slavery. Others became slaves when they were captured in wars. Slaves performed a wide variety of jobs in Athens, including tasks that required a great deal of skill. Some slaves ran households and tutored Athenian children. A number of slaves were trained as craftsmen. Others worked in farms or factories. Some slaves worked for the city as clerks. The unluckiest slaves worked in silver mines. They might work 10 hours a day in cramped tunnels 300 feet below the surface. They had little air to breathe and were often whipped if they stopped to rest. All right, our last section is section 10, chapter 27, Women and Slaves in Sparta. Spartan women lived the same simple life as Spartan men. They wore plain clothing with little decoration. They did not wear jewelry or use cosmetics or perfume. Like Spartan men, women were expected to be strong and healthy and ready to fight. A woman was expected to look after her husband's property in times of war. She also had to guard it against invaders and revolts from slaves. Spartan women had many rights that other Greek women did not have. They were free to speak with their husband's friends. They could own and control their own property. They could even marry another man if their first husband had been away at war for too long. Spartan slaves, the Helots, were people who had been conquered by the Spartans. There were many more Helots than citizens in Sparta. The Spartans were afraid that the Helots would revolt, so they treated them very harshly. The government sometimes declared war on the Helots so that it could legally kill any slaves they thought might rebel. Once the Spartan government asked the Helots to choose their best fighters. The Spartans said these men would be set free as thanks for fighting for Sparta. 2,000 Helots were chosen. Immediately, the Spartans killed every one of them to eliminate any future Helot leaders. Despite this treatment, Helots actually had some rights. They could marry whomever and whenever they wanted. They could pass their names on to their children. They could sell any extra crops they had after giving their master his share. If they saved enough money, they could even buy their freedom. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 27, looking at Athens versus Sparta. Next, we're going to be creating 2 postcards where you are going to pretend to have visited each of these city-states, and you're going to be writing a message home to a loved one, again, in the time of ancient history. So we'll get more information on that project, but again, I hope you enjoyed your time in Athens and Sparta, and look for more directions on the postcards coming soon. Thanks, everyone.